Imagine being 23 years old, standing on the deck of a naval vessel, camera in hand, knowing that what you're about to photograph will change everything you believe about the world. Now imagine that same moment, but add one terrifying detail. You've been explicitly told that if you ever speak about what you capture through your lens, you'll disappear. This is the true story of a naval photographer during Operation Highjump, the largest Antarctic expedition in human history, whose film was confiscated, sealed, and locked in a classified vault for 70 years. What did he see through his camera that winter of 1947? What was so dangerous, so world-shattering that it had to be hidden from humanity for 7 decades? Before we journey into this frozen mystery together, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now. Ring that notification bell. Because stories like this, stories that challenge everything we've been taught, need to reach every corner of the world. Share this video with someone who questions the official narrative, someone who knows that history has more secrets than answers. Together, we're going to uncover what really happened at the bottom of the world and why they never wanted you to know about it. The war had ended 16 months earlier. Cities across Europe and Asia were still rebuilding from the devastation. Millions of soldiers had returned home, eager to forget the horrors they'd witnessed and start new lives. The world was exhausted, traumatized, and broke. So why, in December of 1946, did the United States Navy launch the most expensive, most heavily staffed expedition in Antarctic history? Operation Highjump wasn't some small research mission. This was a full-scale military invasion of Antarctica. 4,700 men, 13 ships including an aircraft carrier, a submarine, and multiple icebreakers, 33 aircraft. The official explanation was laughably simple: testing equipment in cold weather and establishing research bases. But here's what doesn't make sense. The Navy had just spent 4 years fighting the most devastating war in human history. Resources were stretched thin. The budget was strained. Veterans were flooding back into civilian life, overwhelming the system. And yet somehow the military found the money, the manpower, and the justification to send nearly 5,000 men to the most inhospitable place on Earth for what they claimed was routine cold weather testing. Admiral Richard Byrd was chosen to lead this expedition. Now, Byrd wasn't just any naval officer. He was already a legend, a polar explorer whose name was synonymous with Antarctic adventure. He'd flown over the South Pole in 1929, established Little America Base in 1933, and had more experience with Antarctic conditions than virtually anyone alive. But here's the interesting part. When Byrd was summoned to the Pentagon in October 1946 for his initial briefing on Operation Highjump, he emerged from that meeting visibly shaken. Multiple witnesses reported that the confident, charismatic explorer they'd known seemed troubled, distracted, almost fearful. Whatever he'd been told in that classified briefing had changed him. One of his closest friends later recalled that Byrd had said something cryptic that evening. "This isn't about science. This is about securing what we found before someone else does." What had they found? That question brings us to James Robbins, a young naval photographer from Oregon who had survived some of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific theater. Robbins had documented Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the aftermath of Hiroshima. His photographs had appeared in Life magazine. He'd won commendations for his steady nerves under fire and his ability to capture clear images in chaotic combat situations. He was chosen for Operation Highjump specifically because of his record. The Navy needed photographers who wouldn't panic, who wouldn't ask questions, and who knew how to keep their mouths shut. On November 28, 1946, Robbins received his orders. He was to report to Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia within 48 hours. No details were provided about the mission, its duration, or its destination. Just coordinates and a date. When Robbins arrived at Norfolk, he found himself among a strange mix of personnel. There were the usual Navy sailors and officers, but there were also scientists, intelligence officers, and men in civilian clothes who wouldn't identify their agencies. The atmosphere was tense, secretive. Men spoke in hushed voices and stopped talking when strangers approached. Robbins was issued specialized cold weather gear, enough film and photographic supplies for 6 months, and a document he had to sign before boarding. The document was simple but chilling. Everything he photographed during this mission was automatically classified at the highest level. The negatives, the prints, even his personal notes, all belonged to the United States government. Unauthorized disclosure would be treated as treason. Robbins signed without hesitation. He'd signed similar documents before, but something about this one felt different. The officer who witnessed his signature looked him directly in the eye and said, "You're going to see things that will test everything you believe. Remember your oath." The convoy departed Norfolk on December 2, 1946. 13 ships spread across the Atlantic Ocean heading south toward a destination that most of the crew didn't even know yet. Robbins spent his time on the USS Philippine Sea, an aircraft carrier that would serve as one of the primary operational bases for aerial reconnaissance missions. The journey took 3 weeks, and during that time, Robbins noticed something unusual. The officers were conducting briefings, but only in small groups, and each group seemed to receive different information. It was compartmentalization taken to an extreme level. Pilots were briefed separately from navigators. Ground crew was briefed separately from communications officers. And the photographers, there were 12 of them in total, received their own specialized briefing that made Robbins' blood run cold. The briefing was conducted by a naval intelligence officer who introduced himself only as Commander Hayes. He stood before the 12 photographers in a sealed room deep in the carrier's interior and spoke for 30 minutes without notes. His message was clear. They were heading to Antarctica to document what previous expeditions had discovered. There had been flights over the continent earlier that year, reconnaissance missions that had detected anomalies, structures, things that shouldn't exist. Operation Highjump's primary objective was to photograph these anomalies comprehensively, map their locations, and gather enough visual evidence for intelligence analysts back in Washington to assess what they were dealing with. Commander Hayes emphasized that word, assess. Not study, not understand, but assess, as if they were evaluating a threat. Then Hayes said something that Robbins would never forget. "Gentlemen, you may photograph things that appear to be artificial structures, possibly ancient, possibly not. You may see technology that seems advanced beyond current capabilities. You may even encounter," and here he paused, choosing his words carefully, "indications that we are not alone in our interest in this continent. Your job is to document, not to interpret. Your job is to capture images, not to draw conclusions. And most importantly, your job is to remember that nothing you photograph exists until the United States government says it exists. Is that clear?" The photographers nodded in silence, but Robbins could see the same question in every man's eyes. What the hell are we flying into? They crossed the Antarctic Circle on December 24, 1946, Christmas Eve in the most desolate place on Earth. The temperature had dropped to 35 degrees below zero, and the ocean was choked with icebergs that loomed out of the fog like frozen cathedrals. Robbins stood on deck, his camera protected under his coat, watching the alien landscape emerge around them. The ice here was ancient, compressed by its own weight into formations that seemed almost crystalline, glowing with an inner blue light when the sun hit them at the right angle. But what struck Robbins most was the silence. Not the quiet you experience in a library or a forest, but absolute silence, as if sound itself had frozen and fallen into the ocean. In that silence you could hear things that shouldn't be audible, the groaning of ice miles away, the whisper of wind across glaciers, and sometimes, if you listened carefully, something else. A low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from beneath the ice itself. Admiral Byrd established the main base, Little America 4, on the Ross Ice Shelf on December 27th. The location had been used by previous expeditions, but this time the setup was far more extensive. Within 48 hours, they had erected dozens of structures, living quarters, operation centers, storage facilities, and most notably, a heavily guarded communications building that linked directly to Washington via encrypted channels. Robbins and the other photographers were assigned to a separate barracks, isolated from the main camp. Their film was to be processed on-site in a dark room that was under constant armed guard. No photographer would be allowed to process his own film. Everything would be developed by specialized technicians. cataloged by intelligence officers, and the original negatives would be sealed immediately. The aerial reconnaissance missions began on January 2, 1947. Robbins was assigned to fly with Lieutenant Commander David Bunger, a veteran pilot who had flown missions in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters during the war. Their first 3 missions were routine, or as routine as flying over Antarctica could be. They photographed ice formations, mapped coastlines, and documented mountain ranges that had never been seen by human eyes. Robbins shot roll after roll of film, capturing the stark beauty and terrifying vastness of the frozen continent. But on their 4th mission, January 15th, everything changed. The flight plan took them inland beyond the mapped coastal regions, into territory that was marked on their charts only as unexplored. They flew for 3 hours, seeing nothing but ice and rock, an endless white desert that stretched to every horizon. Then Bunger saw it. At first he thought it was a mirage, a trick of the Antarctic light playing on ice crystals in the air. But as they flew closer, there was no denying what lay before them. In the middle of the frozen wasteland, surrounded by glaciers and ice fields, was a massive lake of open water, not frozen, not covered, but liquid water, steaming in the minus 40-degree air. The lake was roughly 20 miles long and 5 miles wide, its surface a deep blue that seemed almost artificial in its intensity. Bunger immediately radioed back to base, reporting the discovery, and was ordered to investigate further before returning. He dropped altitudes, circling the lake in a descending spiral, while Robbins scrambled to change lenses and capture every angle. Through the viewfinder of his camera, Robbins could see details that were invisible to the naked eye. The telephoto lens brought distant features into sharp focus, and what he saw made his hands shake despite his years of combat photography experience. The water was crystal clear, so clear that he could see dozens of feet down into the depths, and there, beneath the surface, were structures, not rock formations, not natural geological features, but structures. He could make out what appeared to be walls, straight lines and right angles that nature doesn't produce. There were columns, cylindrical and evenly spaced, supporting something massive that extended deeper than his lens could penetrate. And there were openings, dark entrances carved into the underwater rock face, leading to spaces that his imagination couldn't begin to fill. Robbins shot an entire roll of film in less than 5 minutes, his professional training taking over as his mind struggled to process what he was documenting. He changed roles without looking away from the viewfinder, his fingers working on muscle memory alone. The patterns beneath the water were becoming clearer as Bunger adjusted their altitude and angle. There were symbols carved into some of the stone surfaces, intricate geometric designs that covered entire sections of wall. These weren't crude scratches or simple markings. These were sophisticated, precise, clearly intentional communications or decorations created by beings with advanced understanding of mathematics and engineering. The symbols seemed to flow across the stone in patterns that suggested language, though not any language Robbins had ever seen. But what captured Robbins' attention, what made him forget to breathe for a moment, was the object he spotted floating just beneath the surface near the center of the lake. It was cylindrical, approximately 30 feet long and 10 feet in diameter, with a surface that reflected light in a way that stone or ice never could. This was metal, or something like metal, smooth and seamless. The object was positioned horizontally, parallel to the lake bottom, at a depth of maybe 50 feet. It wasn't resting on the bottom, it was suspended in the water as if held there by some invisible force. And most disturbing of all, the object appeared to be intact, undamaged, as if it had been placed there recently, rather than being some ancient relic. Bunger wanted to descend further, to get close enough to potentially land on the lake's shore and investigate on foot. But before he could make that decision, the radio exploded with urgent transmissions. The voice was Admiral Byrd himself, ordering them to return to base immediately. Not after completing their reconnaissance, not after finishing their photographic survey, but immediately. The tone left no room for discussion. Bunger acknowledged the order and banked the aircraft sharply, setting a course back to Little America 4. As they climbed away from the impossible lake, Robbins looked back through his camera, capturing a few final shots. In one of those shots, barely visible in the developed photograph he would see 70 years later, Something was emerging from one of those underwater entrances. Something large, something moving with purpose, something that had no business existing in Antarctica or anywhere else on Earth. The flight back was conducted in complete radio silence. Bunger's face was grim, his jaw clenched so tight that Robbins could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. When they finally landed at Little America 4, they were met on the ice strip by armed Marines. Not regular guards, but Marines in full combat gear, weapons at the ready as if expecting an attack. Before Robbins could even unbuckle his harness, a Marine corporal climbed into the aircraft and extended his hand. "Your camera, sir. All film, all equipment, immediately." Robbins hesitated for just a moment, and in that moment he saw the corporal's hand move toward his sidearm. The message was clear. Robbins handed over his camera bag, watching as the Marine checked every pocket, every compartment, ensuring that no film canisters remained hidden. Robbins and Bunger were escorted, that's the polite word, to a heated tent where 3 intelligence officers were waiting. The debriefing lasted 4 hours. Every detail of the flight was documented. The exact coordinates where they discovered the lake, the altitude, and angle at which Robbins had taken his photographs, the precise description of everything they'd seen beneath the water. The officers took notes continuously, occasionally conferring in whispered conversations that the 2 men couldn't hear. When asked directly what Robbins thought he'd photographed, he gave the only answer he could. "Structures, sir. Artificial structures, possibly very old, beneath the surface of that lake." One of the officers, a man who'd identified himself only as being from naval intelligence, looked at Robbins with an expression that was equal parts pity and warning. "No, sailor, you photographed unusual rock formations and tricks of light on ice. That's what will be in your official report. That's what you'll remember. Understood?" But Robbins and Bunger weren't the only ones encountering impossibilities on the ice. Across the expedition, similar discoveries were being made and immediately classified. A ground team working near the Transantarctic Mountains reported finding an entrance to a cave system that descended far deeper than their equipment could measure. More disturbing, they reported that the temperature inside the cave was significantly warmer than the external environment, warm enough that ice couldn't form. The rock walls of the cave bore tool marks, clear evidence of excavation by intelligent beings. The team also found what they described as machinery, devices embedded in the cave walls that still seemed to be operational, humming with a faint vibration that could be felt through gloved hands. Another flight crew, this one piloting a Martin Mariner flying boat, reported an encounter that sounded like something from a science fiction novel. While conducting a mapping mission along the coast, they observed 3 disc-shaped objects rise from the ocean, accelerate to impossible speeds, and disappear into the sky. The pilot, a decorated war veteran named Lieutenant William Kearns, estimated their speed at over 3,000 miles per hour, far beyond the capabilities of any known aircraft. When he reported this encounter to base, he was ordered to return immediately and was debriefed for 6 hours. His official flight log for that day makes no mention of the incident. In fact, several hours of his log are simply missing, replaced with a notation that reads, "Classified by order of Naval Intelligence." The most significant event, the one that would cast a shadow over Operation Highjump and Antarctic exploration for decades to come, was Admiral Byrd's extended flight on February 19, 1947. The flight was supposed to be a standard reconnaissance mission over the South Pole, covering territory that Byrd himself had explored years earlier, but the flight lasted 7 hours, far longer than the planned duration, and covered a distance that official records claim was 1,700 miles. When Byrd returned to base, multiple witnesses reported that he looked like a man who had seen something beyond human comprehension. He was pale, shaking, and seemed to have aged years in a single day. Byrd was immediately taken to his private quarters and wasn't seen by regular expedition members for 3 days. During that time, he met only with the highest-ranking intelligence officers and maintained constant radio communication with Washington. But secrecy on an expedition of 4,700 men is nearly impossible to maintain. Rumors spread quickly through the camps. Men whispered about what Byrd might have seen. Some claimed he'd discovered an entrance to a hollow Earth, a theory that had circulated in certain circles for decades. Others believed he'd encountered evidence of Nazi survival, secret bases built during the war where German forces had retreated, and some, the ones who would be labeled as crazy or conspiracy theorists, suggested that Byrd had made contact with something not of this Earth. Years later, fragments of Byrd's personal diary from that period would surface, though their authenticity has been hotly debated. In these diary entries, Byrd describes flying over the pole and suddenly noticing that his instruments were malfunctioning. His compass spun wildly, his altimeter gave impossible readings, and the temperature gauges showed a rapid increase despite his altitude. Then, according to the diary, the ice below him simply ended. He found himself flying over green land, forests and rivers and terrain that looked like it belonged in a temperate zone, not at the South Pole. He described seeing animals that resembled mammoths moving through the landscape, and most incredibly, he wrote about being intercepted by disc-shaped aircraft that forced his plane to land at a city, a gleaming metropolis of impossible architecture, where he met with beings who called themselves the Elder Race. Of course, this sounds like complete fantasy. The diary entries read like pulp science fiction from the era. But here's what makes them disturbing. The United States government has never officially denied their authenticity. When asked directly about Byrd's polar flight and his diary entries, official responses have always been variations of no comment or those materials remain classified. Why would the government refuse to simply call them forgeries if that's what they were? Why maintain classification on documents that are supposedly fictional? The simplest explanation is often the correct one. And in this case, the simple explanation is that something happened during that flight, something significant enough that the government prefers to let speculation run wild rather than reveal the truth. On March 3, 1947, just days after returning from his mysterious flight, Admiral Byrd gave an interview to a journalist from El Mercurio, a Chilean newspaper. The interview was conducted in Santiago during a brief stopover as Byrd was making his way back to the United States. His words in that interview have been quoted, misquoted, and analyzed countless times over the decades, but the core message remains chilling, regardless of translation. Byrd spoke about the necessity for America to protect itself against hostile regions. He mentioned the possibility of a new enemy who could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. He warned that in the event of another war, America could be attacked by fighters that could fly over one pole or both poles with tremendous speed. This wasn't typical post-war paranoia about Soviet bombers or emerging jet technology. Byrd was describing something else entirely, something that possessed capabilities far beyond anything the United States or Soviet Union had developed. The interview was picked up by a few newspapers in South America, but was largely ignored by the American press. Within days, Admiral Byrd was ordered to Washington for extensive debriefing. He was instructed to make no further statements to the press about Operation Highjump or Antarctica without prior approval from naval intelligence. For the most part, Byrd complied, though those close to him reported that he seemed troubled, distracted, and deeply concerned about what he'd witnessed during his polar flight. Operation Highjump was originally scheduled to last 6 to 8 months, continuing through the Antarctic summer and into the fall of 1947. The expedition had sufficient supplies, equipment, and personnel to maintain operations well into June. Plans were in place to establish permanent research stations that would be manned year-round. The scientific objectives included extensive mapping, geological surveys, and biological studies that would require months of sustained work. But on March 1, 1947, just 8 weeks after arriving in Antarctica, the order came down from Washington: terminate the expedition immediately. Not in a few weeks, not after completing critical research, but immediately. Ships were to be loaded, bases were to be abandoned, and all personnel were to be evacuated from the continent as quickly as possible. The official explanation for this sudden termination was equally sudden. Weather conditions and mechanical failures had made continued operations too dangerous, but anyone who was actually there knew this was nonsense. Yes, Antarctica is dangerous. Yes, the weather is harsh and unpredictable, but Operation Highjump had been planned with these factors in mind. The expedition had experienced weather that was well within expected parameters. Equipment failures had been minimal and easily manageable. There was no legitimate operational reason to abort the mission with such urgency. The real reason, the one that men would whisper about for decades but could never prove, was that they'd been ordered to leave because of what they'd discovered. The withdrawal was chaotic and hasty. Scientific equipment was abandoned in place, too bulky or time-consuming to pack properly. Photographs and documents were gathered frantically, sorted roughly into classified and unclassified categories. Some film canisters went missing during this chaos, either lost accidentally or perhaps hidden deliberately by personnel who wanted evidence to survive outside official channels. Years later, some of these missing photographs would surface in unexpected places, appearing in books and documentaries that the government would neither confirm nor deny. The aircraft were loaded onto the carriers with unusual care, as if they might contain evidence that needed to be preserved and secured. And the men, all 4,700 of them, were assembled for final briefings that amounted to threats disguised as reminders about operational security. James Robbins stood with the other photographers in a frozen Quonset hut on March 5, 1947, listening to Commander Hayes explain what would happen next. Every photograph taken during the expedition was now classified. Every negative, every print, every piece of film was property of the United States government and would be transported under armed guard back to Washington. Any photographer who discussed the content of his work with anyone, including family members, would be subject to court-martial and imprisonment. Hayes was explicit about this. You've documented things that, if revealed publicly, could cause panic, could undermine confidence in our government, and could compromise national security in ways you cannot imagine. What you've seen, what you've photographed, is now locked in your minds and in our vaults. That's where it will stay, forever if necessary. The voyage back to the United States took 3 weeks, and during that time, the mood aboard the ships was somber, almost funeral. Men who had arrived in Antarctica excited about adventure and discovery were returning home confused, frightened, and sworn to silence about experiences they barely understood themselves. Robbins spent most of the journey alone on deck, watching the ice recede behind them and wondering if he'd ever know the full story of what they'd stumbled into down there. He thought about the structures beneath Bunger Lake, the symbols carved into stone, the metallic objects suspended in crystal-clear water. He thought about Admiral Byrd's haunted expression and the rumors about disc-shaped craft rising from the ocean. And he thought about the simple, terrifying question that nobody seemed able or willing to answer. If we discovered something that profound in Antarctica, who or what discovered us? The ships of Operation Highjump arrived back in the United States in late March and early April of 1947, docking at various naval bases along the East Coast. The men were processed through standard debriefing procedures, but with one significant addition. Each participant was required to sign additional non-disclosure agreements that were far more comprehensive and threatening than the initial documents they'd signed before departing. These new agreements specified that violation would result not just in military punishment, but in criminal prosecution under espionage statutes. The message was unmistakable. What happened in Antarctica was not to be discussed, ever, under any circumstances, with anyone. James Robbins returned to civilian life that summer. He was honorably discharged from the Navy with commendations for his service and a recommendation that would help him find work as a photographer. He moved to California, settling in Los Angeles, where the photography market was booming with the post-war expansion. He found work quickly, doing commercial photography for advertising agencies and magazines. The pay was good, the work was interesting, and slowly, methodically, he tried to forget Antarctica. He dated a schoolteacher named Margaret, married her in 1949, and started a family. To all outward appearances, James Robbins was a successful veteran, taking advantage of the opportunities that post-war America offered to young men with skills and ambition. But the nightmares never stopped. 2 or 3 times a week, Robbins would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, having dreamed about the lake. In these dreams, he was back in Bunger's aircraft, camera pressed to his face, watching as something massive rose from those underwater entrances. Sometimes the thing that emerged was mechanical, a craft of impossible design moving with fluid grace through the water. Sometimes it was organic, something alive but utterly alien, tentacles or appendages that defied description. And sometimes it was both, or neither, something that his sleeping mind couldn't categorize or understand. He would wake from these dreams with the absolute certainty that whatever he'd glimpsed in those final photographs was still there, still waiting beneath the ice, aware somehow that it had been seen. Margaret knew something had happened to her husband in Antarctica, but she never pressed him for details. She could see the toll it took on him, the way he would sometimes stare off into space, his jaw clenched, his hands forming fists. Once, early in their marriage, she asked him directly what he'd seen down there. Robbins had looked at her with such profound sadness that she immediately regretted the question. "I saw things that proved everything we believe about history is wrong," he said quietly. "And I was told that if I ever spoke about those things, I wouldn't just go to prison, I would disappear. People I love would be in danger. So I can't tell you, Margaret. I can't tell anyone. And I have to live with that until I die." The 1950s were a strange time for anyone interested in unusual phenomena. The modern UFO era began in June of 1947, just 3 months after Operation Highjump ended, when pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 unusual objects flying in formation near Mount Rainier in Washington. Arnold's description of their motion, like saucers skipping across water, gave birth to the term flying saucer and triggered a wave of sightings across the country. Then came the Roswell incident in July of 1947, where something crashed on a ranch in New Mexico, something that the military initially announced was a flying disc before quickly changing the story to a weather balloon. These events, coming so soon after Operation Highjump, seemed like more than coincidence to those who knew what had really been discovered in Antarctica. Robbins watched this all unfold with a sinking feeling in his stomach. He saw the patterns, the connections that others missed. Operation Highjump discovers impossible structures and advanced technology in Antarctica in January and February. Admiral Byrd warns about threats that can fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds in March. Then, just 3 months later, flying disc sightings begin across America. Either this was the most unlikely series of coincidences in history, or something had been awakened or alerted by the expedition's activities in Antarctica. Robbins never shared these thoughts with anyone. He kept his head down, raised his children, and tried to live a normal life while carrying the weight of knowledge that felt increasingly unbearable as the years passed. In October of 1956, 9 years after Operation Highjump, James Robbins was working in his photography studio in Los Angeles when a man in a dark suit walked through his door. The man didn't look at the photographs displayed on the walls. He didn't browse the price lists or ask about services. He simply stood in the doorway until Robbins noticed him, then walked directly to the counter and placed a business card face down on the surface. Robbins flipped the card over and felt his blood run cold. The card identified the man as Special Agent Robert Chen, Defense Intelligence Agency. No phone number, no address, just a name, an agency, and a seal that looked official and threatening. "Mr. Robbins," the man said quietly, "I'm here to discuss Antarctica." Those 4 words, spoken calmly in his studio on a sunny California afternoon, transported Robbins back to the ice, back to the fear and wonder and confusion of those weeks in 1947. He glanced toward the back room where his assistant was processing film, then looked back at Agent Chen and nodded once. They went to a diner down the street, a public place where their conversation would be hidden by the noise of other patrons and clattering dishes. Chen ordered coffee but didn't drink it. He simply sat across from Robbins and delivered a message that was both fascinating and terrifying. "Your film still exists," Chen said without preamble. "The canisters you shot during Operation Highjump are stored in a classified facility in Virginia. They've never been developed. They've never been viewed. They simply exist, sealed in their original containers, awaiting a decision about their disposition." Robbins' heart was pounding. He'd assumed his film had been destroyed years ago, burned or dissolved in acid to eliminate any evidence of what he'd photographed. The idea that those images still existed, that somewhere in a vault his pictures of the impossible lake and its underwater structures were waiting, was almost too much to process. "Why are you telling me this?" Robbins asked. Chin leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "Because there's a new expedition being planned, the International Geophysical Year, 1957 to 58, multiple nations working together to study Antarctica comprehensively. The United States needs to return to the sites that were discovered during Operation Highjump. We need to understand what we found, and we need photographers who've seen those sites before, who know what to look for, who understand the significance." Chin paused, letting this sink in. "We want you to go back, Mr. Robbins. We want you to return to Antarctica and photograph those structures again. But this time with better equipment, more time, and clearer objectives." Robbins sat in silence for a long moment, watching steam rise from his untouched coffee. Finally, he shook his head. "No, I'm not going back there. I have a wife. I have children. I have a life here that doesn't include freezing to death at the bottom of the world while photographing things I'm not allowed to talk about." Chin nodded as if he'd expected this response. "I understand. But I need you to understand something too. Those structures you photographed aren't abandoned. We've had reconnaissance flights over that lake, over other sites. There's activity down there. Movement. Whatever built those structures, or whatever is using them now, is still present, still active. And we need to know what we're dealing with." "Then send younger photographers," Robbins said. "Men who don't have families, who haven't already sacrificed enough for secrets they can't share." Chin stood to leave, but paused at the table. "Your film will remain classified indefinitely, Mr. Robbins. That's not a threat, that's just reality. But I want you to know that your photographs represent some of the clearest evidence we have of what exists beneath Antarctic ice. If we ever reach a point where disclosure is possible, where the public can be told the truth, your work will be part of that revelation. You documented something extraordinary. That matters, even if you never see those images again." Chin left cash on the table for the coffee and walked out of the diner, disappearing into the Los Angeles sunshine and leaving Robbins alone with thoughts he'd tried for 9 years to suppress. James Robbins never returned to Antarctica. He continued his commercial photography career through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, watching as technology evolved and the world changed in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1947. He saw America go to the moon, an achievement that should have answered the question of whether humanity was alone in the universe, but somehow only deepened the mystery. He watched as satellites began mapping Earth from orbit, revealing details of geography that had been hidden for millennia. And he watched as Antarctica slowly moved from being a frozen mystery to being a focal point of international scientific research, with dozens of nations maintaining permanent bases on the continent. But the questions Robbins carried never left him. He read everything he could find about Antarctic research, looking for hints that someone, somewhere, was investigating the structures he'd photographed. There were tantalizing clues over the years. In 1961, Soviet scientists at Vostok Station began drilling into the ice, eventually discovering Lake Vostok, a massive body of liquid water beneath 2.5 miles of ice. The lake had been isolated from the surface for potentially millions of years, a completely sealed ecosystem that might harbor life forms unknown to science. When Russian drilling finally reached the lake in 2012, their findings were kept remarkably quiet, with only vague press releases about microbial discoveries and environmental concerns. In the 1980s, ground-penetrating radar technology advanced to the point where scientists could map features beneath Antarctic ice with unprecedented detail. Research papers began appearing in scientific journals describing unusual formations beneath the ice, geometric patterns that didn't match any known natural geological processes. These papers were always carefully worded, suggesting that further study was needed, that the data was ambiguous, that natural explanations were still most likely. But Robbins could read between the lines. The scientists were finding the same things Operation Highjump had found 30 years earlier. They just weren't allowed to say so directly. Robbins' wife Margaret died in 1998, and with her passing, he lost the one person who had shared his burden even without knowing the details. Their children were grown, living their own lives across the country, and Robbins found himself increasingly isolated. He sold his photography studio and retired to a small house in Oregon, not far from where he'd grown up. He spent his days reading, walking along the coast, and thinking about the frozen continent at the bottom of the world where the greatest secrets of human history were buried beneath miles of ice. He was 90 years old, had lived a full life by any measure, but still carried the weight of knowledge that felt like unfinished business. Then in 2015, his doorbell rang on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Robbins shuffled to the door, not expecting visitors, and found a young woman standing on his porch with a leather briefcase and a nervous smile. She introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher working with the National Archives on declassification projects. She was, she explained, looking into materials from Operation Highjump that had been sitting in storage for nearly 70 years, forgotten by bureaucracy, but never properly archived or reviewed. She'd found references to photographic materials that had been confiscated from expedition photographers but never developed. Would Mr. Robbins be willing to discuss his experiences in Antarctica? Would he help her understand what those photographs might contain? Robbins stared at her for a long moment. This young woman who couldn't have been born when he'd stood on the ice at Little America 4, who had no concept of what it meant to carry secrets for 7 decades. He saw something in her eyes, though, something that reminded him of himself at 23, genuine curiosity, intellectual courage, and a willingness to pursue truth regardless of where it led. He invited her inside, made tea, and for the first time in 68 years, James Robbins began to talk about what he'd really seen through his camera lens in Antarctica. He talked for hours, describing the lake, the structures, the symbols, the impossible objects suspended in the water. He told her about Admiral Byrd's flight, about the rumors and whispers, about the abrupt termination of the expedition and the decades of enforced silence. Dr. Chen listened without interruption, taking notes occasionally, but mostly just absorbing his words. When Robbins finally finished, exhausted from the emotional toll of speaking truths he'd hidden for so long, she looked at him with an expression of profound respect. "Mr. Robbins, I believe you. I believe every word you've said. And I'm going to find your photographs. I'm going to develop them. And if they show what you've described, I'm going to make sure the world sees them. Not today, maybe not next year, but eventually. The truth can't stay buried forever." Robbins felt something then that he hadn't felt in decades. Hope. Maybe his burden wouldn't die with him. Maybe the evidence he'd captured would finally be revealed. Maybe before he passed from this world, he would see those images again and know that his testimony had mattered. Dr. Sarah Chen wasn't entirely who she claimed to be, though she hadn't exactly lied to James Robbins. She did work with materials related to declassification, but not for the National Archives. She was part of a small, unofficial group within the intelligence community that had become convinced that America's various secret programs had created a backlog of classified information that was becoming counterproductive. Secrets from the 1940s and 50s, they argued, no longer served national security and in fact hindered it by preventing proper analysis and understanding of historical events. These individuals, scattered across various agencies and departments, called themselves the Transparency Working Group, though that name appeared in no official documents. The TWG had identified Operation Highjump as a priority target for their efforts. The expedition represented a nexus point where multiple strange phenomena seemed to converge: advanced technology, possible non-human intelligence, and aggressive suppression of information. If they could crack open the Operation Highjump files, if they could force disclosure of what had really been discovered, it would set a precedent for revealing other classified programs. But the problem was that Operation Highjump materials were scattered across multiple storage facilities, buried in archives that weren't indexed properly, or simply lost in the chaos of 70 years of bureaucratic shuffling. Finding James Robbins's film canisters was like searching for a specific grain of sand on a beach. Dr. Chen spent 18 months following paper trails through military records, storage manifests, and transfer logs. She visited facilities in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, digging through boxes of materials that hadn't been touched since they were initially stored. She found references to Robbins's film in a manifest from March 1947, listing 12 canisters that had been transferred from the USS Philippine Sea to Naval Intelligence custody. Another document showed those canisters being moved to a long-term storage facility in Fort Meade, Maryland in 1953. Then the trail went cold for decades until a brief notation in a 1991 inventory mentioned photographic materials, Operation Highjump, various photographers, being transferred to a consolidated storage complex in rural Virginia. The Virginia facility was massive, a former Cold War bunker that had been converted to document storage after the Soviet Union collapsed. It contained millions of cubic feet of materials, most of it unindexed, much of it simply stacked in rooms with minimal organization. Dr. Chen spent weeks there, working with a small team of archivists who were sympathetic to the TWG's goals. They searched through boxes labeled with nothing more than Navy 1940s or photographic materials classified. It was tedious, exhausting work, but in October of 2016, they found what they were looking for. A wooden crate approximately 2 feet by 2 feet by 1 foot deep, marked with a stencil designation, OP Highjump, Photo Robbins J. Inside the crate, packed in layers of protective material, were 12 metal canisters. Each canister was sealed with tape that had turned brown with age, marked with a date from January or February 1947. The canisters showed no signs of corrosion or damage. They had been stored in climate-controlled conditions for 70 years, protected from humidity and temperature fluctuations that could have destroyed the film inside. Dr. Chen felt her hands shaking as she logged the discovery and arranged for the canisters to be transported to a facility where they could be properly processed. This was it. This was the evidence that could prove everything James Robbins had described. Or it was nothing. Decades of anticipation leading to blank negatives, or images too degraded to be useful. The development of the film was scheduled for February of 2017, exactly 70 years after Robbins had shot those photographs. Dr. Chen arranged for Robbins to be present, flying him to Washington and putting him up in a hotel near the Library of Congress where the development would take place. Robbins, now 94 years old and physically frail but mentally sharp, sat in a wheelchair outside the dark room, watching through a window as technicians worked with his ancient film. The process took hours, each frame requiring careful handling to avoid destroying the fragile emulsion. Dr. Chen stood beside Robbins, neither of them speaking, both understanding that they were about to see something that had been hidden from the world for 7 decades. The first images that emerged were unremarkable. Ice fields, mountains, the stark beauty of Antarctica, captured through a skilled photographer's eye. Then came the aerial shots of Bunger Lake, and both Robbins and Dr. Chen leaned forward involuntarily. The lake was clearly visible, steaming in the frozen landscape, impossibly blue and entirely ice-free. The technician processing the film called out, "These are extraordinary. The clarity is remarkable for film this old." More images appeared, closer shots of the lake, and now the underwater features were becoming visible. Columns, walls, geometric patterns that definitely weren't natural rock formations. Dr. Chen heard Robbins whisper beside her, "They survived. Thank God they survived." The photographs were more remarkable than even James Robbins had remembered. 70 years had softened his memory, making him wonder if perhaps he'd exaggerated what he'd seen, if his young mind had manufactured significance from ambiguous images. But the developed photographs removed all doubt. There, in black and white clarity that was startling considering the film's age, were structures that should not exist in Antarctica. The underwater columns were evenly spaced, clearly artificial, supporting what appeared to be massive platforms or buildings that extended into the depths beyond where his camera could penetrate. The symbols carved into the stone surfaces were complex and clearly intentional. They weren't random scratches or geological features misinterpreted by wishful thinking. These were precise geometric designs, mathematical patterns that suggested sophisticated understanding of principles that modern humanity had only discovered in recent centuries. One photograph showed a section of wall where the symbols seemed to flow in a spiral pattern, each element connecting to the next in a way that suggested syntax, grammar, an actual language encoded in mathematical relationships. Dr. Chen immediately recognized that these weren't like any ancient human writing system. They were something else, something that would require entirely new analytical approaches to even begin understanding. But the most incredible images came from the final roll of film, the one Robbins had loaded in those last frantic minutes before Admiral Byrd ordered them back to base. The telephoto lens had captured details that were almost too clear, too precise to be believed. The cylindrical metallic object floating beneath the lake's surface was visible in multiple frames, from different angles as Bunger had circled the lake. In one particularly sharp image, you could see that the object's surface wasn't smooth as Robbins had remembered. It was covered in fine details, patterns that might have been panels or access ports, designs that served some function he couldn't begin to guess. And the object was pristine, showing no signs of age or decay. This wasn't an ancient relic. This was something that still functioned, still served whatever purpose it had been designed for. The photograph that made Dr. Chen gasp audibly showed the entrance to one of the underwater structures, and there, just barely visible in the darkness of that entrance, was something moving. The image was slightly blurred, suggesting motion, but the shape was clear enough to make out, something large, roughly cylindrical or torpedo-shaped, emerging from the depths. It wasn't a submarine, at least not any design that had existed in 1947 or existed now. It had no visible propulsion system, no conning tower or control surfaces. It simply was a presence in the water that didn't conform to any category Robbins or Dr. Chen could identify. Robbins sat in silence, tears streaming down his weathered face as he looked at photographs he'd shot 7 decades earlier. He'd been 23 years old when he pressed the shutter release and captured these images. He'd been afraid, confused, overwhelmed by what he was witnessing. Now, at 94, with most of his life behind him, he finally had confirmation that he hadn't imagined it, hadn't misinterpreted what he'd seen. The proof was here, developed from film that had survived 70 years in a vault, images that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. "What do we do with these?" he asked quietly. Dr. Chen's answer was simple and determined. "We show the world, but carefully, strategically, in a way that can't be suppressed or dismissed." Dr. Sarah Chen understood that simply posting James Robbins' photographs on the internet would accomplish nothing. They would be dismissed as fakes, clever hoaxes created with Photoshop or other digital manipulation tools. The conspiracy theory community might embrace them, but mainstream science and media would ignore or ridicule them. What was needed was a careful, methodical release that established provenance, demonstrated authenticity, and built credibility through multiple independent sources. This would take time, patience, and a strategy that balanced transparency with protection against suppression. The first step was forensic authentication. Dr. Chen arranged for independent analysis of the film and developed photographs by experts in historical photography and materials science. These experts confirmed that the film stock was consistent with naval photography supplies from the 1940s, that the chemical composition of the emulsion matched period materials, and that the images showed no signs of digital manipulation because they had been created decades before digital photography existed. The development process itself had been documented on video, showing the sealed canisters being opened and the virgin film being processed for the first time. This created a chain of custody that was difficult to dispute. Next, Dr. Chen began working with journalists who had established records of covering unusual phenomena with seriousness and rigor. She provided them with background on Operation Highjump, copies of declassified documents showing the expedition's scale and abrupt termination, and testimony from other surviving expedition members who were willing to discuss their experiences. This built a context around Robbins's photographs, showing that he wasn't a lone crackpot, but one of many witnesses to extraordinary events in Antarctica. Several of these journalists began working on long-form articles and documentary proposals, each approaching the story from different angles, but all using Robbins's photographs as key evidence. The academic approach was equally important. Dr. Chen reached out to researchers in archaeology, ancient history, and comparative linguistics who had published work suggesting that human civilization might be older than mainstream timelines accepted. She shared the photographs with them confidentially, asking for their analysis of the structures and symbols. Several of these researchers were stunned by what they saw. The architectural principles visible in the underwater structures matched features found in ancient sites around the world, from Göbekli Tepe in Turkey to Nan Madol in Micronesia. The symbols showed mathematical sophistication that paralleled work being done in cutting-edge physics and mathematics. These researchers began preparing papers for submission to peer-reviewed journals, carefully framing their analysis to avoid sensationalism while presenting the evidence honestly. Meanwhile, Robbins himself began giving interviews, both video and written, documenting his experiences in detail. At 94, he had nothing to lose by speaking out. The non-disclosure agreements he'd signed in 1947 were probably unenforceable at this point, and even if the government tried to prosecute him, the publicity would only draw more attention to what he was revealing. He spoke with remarkable clarity and consistency, his memory of those weeks in Antarctica as sharp as if they'd happened last year. Interviewers were struck by his sincerity, his lack of embellishment, his willingness to admit when he didn't know something rather than filling gaps with speculation. This was clearly a man telling the truth as he remembered it, not someone spinning tales for attention or profit. The coordinated release began in the spring of 2018. A respected documentary filmmaker released a 40-minute short film titled The Photographer of Operation Highjump, which focused on James Robbins's story without delving too deeply into the implications of what he'd photographed. The film was submitted to several documentary festivals and won awards for historical storytelling. This created mainstream attention and legitimacy, with entertainment outlets covering the film and thus introducing Robbins's name and story to broader audiences. The film ended with Robbins looking directly at the camera and saying, "I photographed something in Antarctica that proves we don't understand our own history. Those photographs exist. They're real. And the world deserves to see them." Shortly after the documentary's release, several of the journalists Dr. Chen had been working with published their pieces. A major magazine ran a cover story titled "What Lies Beneath Antarctica," which featured several of Robbins' less controversial photographs alongside interviews with historians and scientists discussing the possibility of pre-Holocene civilizations. A respected newspaper published a long investigative piece about Operation Highjump itself, documenting the expedition's unusual scale, abrupt termination, and decades of secrecy around its findings. These mainstream publications didn't fully embrace the most extraordinary claims, but they treated the topic seriously, presenting evidence and letting readers draw their own conclusions. The photographs themselves were released in stages, starting with images that were interesting but not world-shattering. The ice landscapes, the aerial views of unexplored territory, the clear documentation of Bunger Lakes. These established Robbins' credibility as a photographer and showed the quality of his work. Then came the underwater structure photographs, released through a dedicated website that provided high-resolution images, technical analysis, and historical context. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, the website had millions of visitors. Scientists, historians, and amateur researchers began downloading the images and conducting their own analysis. Online communities exploded with discussion, debate, and attempts to decode the symbols visible in the photographs. The government's response was notably restrained. There was no aggressive denial, no attempt to confiscate the photographs or silence Robbins. Instead, official statements were carefully vague. "We cannot comment on classified operations from 70 years ago. Historical materials are reviewed for declassification on an ongoing basis according to established procedures. The authenticity of materials released outside official channels cannot be verified by this office." It was a non-response response, neither confirming nor denying, neither attacking nor embracing. This ambiguity actually helped the photograph's credibility. If they were obvious fakes, the government would have said so definitively. The careful non-engagement suggested that there was indeed something real in Robbins's images, something that couldn't be dismissed, but also couldn't be officially acknowledged. James Robbins lived to see the impact of his photographs. He gave dozens of interviews in the months following their release, always with Dr. Chin present to help manage his schedule and protect him from the more aggressive or exploitative media requests. He was invited to speak at conferences, to participate in documentaries, to consult with researchers investigating Antarctica's mysteries. For the first time in 70 years, he could talk openly about what he'd experienced, what he'd seen, what he'd carried alone for most of his life. The burden that had weighed on him since 1947 was finally lifted, shared with a world that was ready, or as ready as it would ever be, to confront these truths. He died peacefully in his sleep on January 12, 2019, 3 months after his 96th birthday. His obituary in major newspapers mentioned his role in documenting Operation Highjump and the controversy surrounding his Antarctic photographs. Some outlets treated him as a brave whistleblower who had revealed suppressed history. Others were more skeptical, framing him as a sincere but possibly mistaken witness to ambiguous events. But everyone agreed on one thing: James Robbins had lived an extraordinary life, had seen things that most humans never would, and had ultimately found the courage to share what he knew despite decades of enforced silence. The release of James Robbins's photographs didn't solve the mystery of Antarctica. If anything, it deepened the questions and expanded the scope of what we don't understand about our planet and our history. The structures he documented beneath Bunger Lake remain largely inaccessible, buried under ice and water in one of the most remote regions on Earth. Attempts to organize expeditions to investigate them have been blocked by the Antarctic Treaty's protocols and by the practical difficulties of operating in such extreme conditions. But satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar continue to reveal more anomalies, more suggestions that Antarctica holds secrets that predate recorded human civilization. Other witnesses from Operation Highjump have come forward since Robbins's photographs were released, encouraged by his example to share their own experiences. A former Navy pilot described encounters with disc-shaped craft that moved at impossible speeds. A radio operator talked about receiving transmissions in languages that weren't German, Russian, English, or any human tongue he recognized. A scientist who participated in geological surveys mentioned finding tool marks in rock formations that were dated to periods when Antarctica should have been buried beneath miles of ice. Each testimony adds another piece to a puzzle that grows more complex and strange with every revelation. The academic community remains divided. Mainstream archaeology and history largely ignore Robbins's photographs or treat them as interesting anomalies that don't warrant revision of established timelines. But a growing number of researchers, particularly younger scholars, less invested in defending traditional narratives, are taking the evidence seriously. Papers are being published, conferences are being organized, and new analytical techniques are being applied to the photographs and other materials from Operation Highjump. Slowly, methodically, a new understanding is emerging. Human civilization is far older, far more advanced in its deep past than we've believed. Or, alternatively, Earth has been visited by non-human intelligence for far longer than we've acknowledged. The structures beneath Antarctica, whether built by ancient humans or something else, represent questions that our civilization will have to confront. As climate change continues to melt the ice sheets, more of these structures will be exposed. Within decades, it may be impossible to maintain the secrecy that has surrounded Antarctica's mysteries for 70 years. The truth, whatever it is, will emerge from beneath the ice. We'll be forced to reconcile our understanding of history, our place in the cosmos, and our assumptions about human uniqueness with evidence that challenges all of those comfortable beliefs. James Robbins's legacy is not just the photographs he took, though those images are extraordinary evidence of something profound. His legacy is the courage he showed in finally speaking out, in refusing to let important truths die with him. He proved that one person, armed with evidence and determination, can challenge official narratives and force uncomfortable questions into public consciousness. His story reminds us that history is not settled, that what we think we know is often incomplete or deliberately misleading, and that the most important discoveries may be those that have been actively hidden from us. The ice is melting, the secrets are emerging, and the questions that James Robbins carried for 70 years are now questions that all of humanity must grapple with. What really lies beneath Antarctica? Who built those structures? When were they built? And most importantly, why has the truth been suppressed for so long? These questions don't have easy answers. They may not have any answers that fit comfortably within our current understanding of reality, but they must be asked. They must be investigated. Because the alternative, continuing to pretend that those structures don't exist, that Robbins's photographs show nothing significant, that Antarctica is just a frozen wasteland with no secrets worth discovering, that alternative is no longer tenable. The truth is emerging from the ice, frame by frame, testimony by testimony, discovery by discovery. And when it finally stands revealed in its entirety, when the full story of what Operation Highjump discovered and what still waits beneath Antarctic ice becomes undeniable, humanity will face a reckoning with its own history. We'll have to rewrite our textbooks, reconsider our origins, and accept that we are not the first and possibly not the only intelligent beings to have called this planet home. James Robbins's photographs are just the beginning. The real story, the complete truth, is still being uncovered. And it's stranger, more profound, and more challenging than anything we've been prepared to accept.